I wanted to just give you a couple of opening comments for context and for some housekeeping, especially because I feel like we need a little bit more of our housekeeping over Zoom. So I'll share that in a moment. But first, just a reminder, I think a lot of you have heard this already, and we've seen some of you this week already, but for anybody who's not familiar with Green Building Alliance, our vision is that every building in every community will be sustainable so that every person can thrive. We work towards that in everything that we do, including events like this where we try to help draw connections for people and help people understand different solutions that are available. I want to thank our sponsor for this series, UPMC. Allison Robinson is on the call today, and she helped me curate this series for you that we're doing right now, and it was a really fun process. So thank you to Allison and UPMC. I also want to thank our speakers today. I think you'll learn a lot from each of them. We have Dave Huffaker from the Port Authority of Allegheny County. He's their Chief Development Officer. We have Kimberly Lucas, who is the Assistant Director of the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. And we have Price, who is the Executive Director of Pittsburgh Region Clean Cities. So I'm really excited to hear from all of them today. Before I start, I just want to tell you all about a couple of other upcoming events that we have that I think you'd be interested in. We're staying pretty busy through the end of the year here at GBA. We have a green building construction tour hosted virtually of the University of Pittsburgh's Hillman Library next week. So that is partially completed. So the team will be sharing the sections of the process that have been completed and the ones that they're still working on. We have our Women in Green breakfast held virtually on November 13th this year, which I'll talk about in a second. And we have a Lead Green Associate exam prep course December 11th and 12th. Other events in this particular series that I think you'd be interested in, because this series is going through the middle of November. So next week is a really interesting one on healthy and transparent building materials. We're going to hear from architects, contractors, building product manufacturers about how they are attempting to collaborate and communicate across industries to ensure that we have healthy and transparent building products. November 5th, we have a couple of experts, one local, one not local, who are going to talk about green cleaning and disinfecting best practices, particularly how we can ensure that the people who are doing the cleaning in our buildings are kept safe and healthy during this time. And then the final one in this series is going to be on the future of building design, where we're actually going to talk about some robotics being applied in building operations and some automation, and how that relates to both how we design our buildings, how we operate, how that impacts energy use, but also how those types of things can help reduce exposure and touchless surfaces and things like that, or increase touchless surfaces. So these are all going to be really interesting, and I hope to see you there. I always have to give a shout out to our Women in Green breakfast. It's going to be amazing this year. We celebrate and support women and femmes working in sustainability, but everyone is welcome who wants to help us celebrate the work being done. And we're going to feature Leah Lizarondo of 412 Food Rescue, and it's going to be a really great morning. So again, just a final reminder on Zoom tips. We'll go ahead and invite you to unmute yourself and share your screen if you want to have conversation during our Q&A. What we're going to do today is I'm going to advance the slides for all of our speakers, and then in between each speaker, because they're each talking about something slightly different, thought it would be good to do Q&A in between for each speaker individually. So please think about your questions and your comments while you're hearing the presentations, and enter them in the chat. I'm going to monitor the chat, and if hopefully we'll have time for all the questions, but let's say after Dave's presentation, I might say, hey, Mark, you had a great question in the chat. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? So that lets us interact a little bit more, and I think it makes for a more engaging afternoon. So please don't hesitate to enter your questions or your comments. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for a discussion as well. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn my video off, and I'm going to invite David Huffaker of the Port Authority of Allegheny County to do his presentation. So let me just go ahead and spotlight your video. And I think you can unmute yourself. Let's see if we can hear you.
Okay, checking.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks, Leslie. So as Leslie said, I'm David Huffaker. I'm the Chief Development Officer at the Port Authority of Allegheny County. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak to this great group In my role at the Port Authority, I oversee our engineering and technical functions, but also our service development team and our planners, including our transit-oriented communities program, our sustainability programs, and a number of interesting initiatives that are very in line with the Green Building Alliance. So I'm really happy to be here. You can go ahead to the next slide, Leslie. So today the topic is health in the built environment, Port Authority of Allegheny County, and the public response or transit response to COVID-19. I'll go through, and the bulk of my presentation is going to cover what has happened with transit and the trends we're seeing here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and then how that also relates to what some of our national and international peers are seeing. I'll talk a little bit about our specific experience with COVID ourselves and our response to that, and then some of the initial steps on kind of returning to normal, if normal is in our future, which I hope it is. And then I also have a couple slides just talking about some of the longer term thinking that we're going through, and I think that will also elicit some potential questions. So please feel free, as Leslie said, to just jot your questions down, and we'll have a great discussion, I hope. So let's go to the next slide. So as you're not surprised, I'm sure, to see, our ridership at the Port Authority dropped precipitously beginning in March with the voluntary shutdown on March 16th, followed by the red phase shortly thereafter on the 22nd. We saw an almost immediate 75 to 80% drop in ridership. It was even more severe on the T. And for those of you who don't know, the T, which is our light rail system and serves the South Hills into downtown, tends to be a little bit more commuter focused than the rest of our service. And so as you would expect with downtown shutting down, we saw a very large decline on the T, down about 90% in the first few weeks. So it's generally a flat line once we drop down that 70 or 80%. We were starting to see an increase in ridership going into mid-May. As you may recall, that was the yellow phase, and I think we were all getting pretty excited when we got to green phase, thinking that we were through the worst of it. So we started to think about, hey, maybe we're going to get out of this, and by the summer we'll be back to normalcy. But then mid or early July, the bars were closed, and we ended up kind of hitting a flat line for basically that period in July until today. The ridership has been pretty flat. We are actually seeing some return to ridership on the T, whereas we were down 90%. Now we're down probably about 75 or so percent. And so seeing a little bit of improvement there, but it has been pretty dire. We'll talk about fares a little bit, but we never actually stopped collecting fares. We just stopped collecting fares on the vehicles themselves. So for those people who used a Connect card or maybe bought an annual pass, those were still valid, and technically people were still required to pay fare, but we stopped the front door boarding on buses to enable the operators to have some social distance from passengers and to avoid having crowded conditions at the front of the bus. And so we effectively went from collecting, say, $1.2 million a week in fare revenues to about 15,000. So it was a significant, that's about 98, 99% drop in revenues. We started charging fares again on June 8th and continue to do that now. You can go to the next slide, Leslie. So with Allegheny County, I guess for context, we've seen, and this was through October 15th, it was about 1.1% of the population had tested positive for COVID. The Port Authority has had, actually until yesterday, 56 confirmed cases. We actually went up to 57 just yesterday afternoon. Knock on wood, we still have not had any deaths among our staff. The 56 represented about 2.1% of Port Authority staff. So it's a little bit higher. In general, you would expect that. I mean, generally our staff are coming from more urban areas. They tend to be populations at higher risk than the general population. And they weren't able to hunker down like the majority of us who, like I am right now, working from home. And so those, the bulk of our employees were still coming into work every day. We have had with each case, we do contact tracing to understand where the origin of the disease was. And aside from a couple clusters that actually happened among maintenance staff, we have not had any cases of transmission from passengers to operators or operators to passengers that we're aware of. So I think that's good news. And I think there's been some national studies that have shown that transit, while there's a concern that transit would be a perhaps super spreader type activity, has not borne out in any sort of data. And so transit has tended to be fairly safe. Just talking about some of the context of our North American peers in terms of light rail ridership, this chart's a little hard to see, but I got this from the Imperial College of London, which facilitates some benchmarking for us. And the yellow line, or maybe orange as it appears on your screen, is the Northeastern United States light rail agencies. And you can see that we had a more severe drop in ridership in the early stages of the pandemic, which would make sense given some of the crises that were happening in New York, New Jersey, and Boston. And whereas the green line, which is Western states, tended to have a little bit lower decline at the start, actually had a quicker recovery than we all did, but they have, as cases spread during the summer, the ridership in the Western agencies also went down. We have agencies from the Canadian Prairies, that would be Calgary and Edmonton, Alberta. There's some Southern agencies, Charlotte, Hampton Roads Transit, and then Pacific Northwest. Interestingly, when it's all said and done by September, everyone's at about the same spot, down about 65% or so. So we're all hoping for some sort of normalcy and some control over the virus to happen. Interestingly, internationally, some of well, I can't really call them peer agencies because they're much, much larger than Pittsburgh, but the Asian subway systems and rail systems are actually now at about 90 to 100% of normal ridership. So there's obviously some structural differences there with propensity to ride transit and the way cities are designed. And there are also some cultural norms around mask wearing. People in Asia have been wearing masks for years prior to the pandemic. So for them, it's less of a statement, or it's just more normal. So for them, the pandemic is essentially over from a transit perspective. You can go to the next slide. So how did we take care of staff and customers? Well, we benefited immensely from the federal response in the form of the CARES Act, which provided more than $100 million in funding for the Port Authority. And that enabled us to do a few things. One, we had a temporary pay agreement with our operators and maintainers, which essentially gave them, they have a limited amount of sick pay that they have. And so our fear was that they would maybe be feeling the effects of COVID, but in order to not use up their sick pay benefits, that they would come into work and potentially infect other people. And so we set up a temporary pay agreement with them that essentially said we will go beyond their normal sick pay benefits, and if they have doctor's note, in essence, or doctor's clearance, or if they have taking care of a loved one at home, or if they are at risk in a number of at-risk communities, then they would be able to stay at home. And so we had several hundred staff who were out of work and still getting full pay. And that was only possible really through the CARES Act, which allowed us to do some of that generous benefit to help protect everyone. We also used those funds to help pay for additional cleaning. We did suspend the collection of fares on the vehicles as I described. And so the CARES Act covers all of the lost fare revenues. And then we're also limiting the capacity on the buses and trains and the incline so that we have a lot of trips that have maybe 15, capacity limit of 15. So there's some lost fares and lost ridership there. We are also requiring masks on transit, and we were doing this despite kind of mixed messages from the federal government. The CDC was not putting out any guidance around mask use in public transit until just this week. Just this week, the CDC has changed its guidance to require or recommend that agencies require masks. So we've been gratified actually that the acceptance for people riding transit has actually been quite high, and the number of cases where people have refused to put on a mask has been very low. So that's been great. Now, as you can imagine, with all of those operators and maintainers out on sick pay or COVID pay, we did have some service that was unable to operate. So we did have some trips that we had to cut due to lack of operators or the inability to put buses out on the system. And so that exacerbated some of the underserved communities that we our service focuses in general on commuters. And it made it very difficult for those transit dependent populations, perhaps someone who lives out in Elizabeth or McKeesport who has very, very poor service and reduced frequencies already. If you have a bus that comes every hour and maybe that trip didn't operate because the operator was sick that day, or maybe the bus was too full and you couldn't get on, you would have to wait a full hour to get on to the next trip. And that's really not acceptable. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with our November service change. When there was a confirmed case at a garage or in our home office at Hines, we would do a complete clean down of the facility and require a 2-week temperature scan. We installed actual temperature kiosks at each of our garages. And so if there has been a confirmed case at a garage, then we require that all staff who are going to work at that location do a temperature scan. And if they are shown to have an elevated fever, then they're sent home. And we also did put out a press release for every single case. And I think for a while it was a little bit alarming for people because they would see another article in the paper of case number 35 and case number 36 and so on and so forth. I think eventually the Post-Gazette got a little tired of putting out the articles, but we do continue to do a press release each time there's a new case resulting from an employee showing up with COVID. So just today we had case number 57. You can go to the next slide. With the November service change, as I talked about, we're actually doing some pretty major changes. This is the largest service change we've made in more than a decade. And at least on a temporary basis, we are shifting some of our service from commuter routes to local routes. And so there are a number of trips that operate long distances and focus on getting people right to downtown Pittsburgh. With the reduction in commuters and people coming into downtown for work, we have seen a very marked decline in those commuter trips. And so we are trying to redirect some of our service so that we can increase the frequencies on some of those local routes. So that route that I described that serves a particular community every hour now is going to be operated every half hour. And that will at least be in play for the next 3 to 6 months as we continue to go through the pandemic. I don't anticipate that we're going to see any major return to normal, at least until 2021. And even then, there is some question as to what normal will look like. So we're using this as an opportunity to try to increase some of the service for the more transit dependent community. And so we're adding frequencies, we're adding larger buses where possible, so that we can increase the capacities on those routes. And we're actually adding quite a bit of weekend service. There are a number of routes that would only operate Monday through Friday. And of course, we're seeing, and with essential workers, many essential workers could be working Tuesday through Sunday type activity schedule. And so this will provide a little bit more flexibility for people who don't have a traditional commuter schedule. We also are adding a connection to Forbes Hospital in Monroeville. That was one of the major hospitals that we did not previously have a connection to. So we were working with the hospital team there to provide not even really an extension of a route, but a redirection of a route that's operating out east of Pittsburgh. But really, we're trying to focus on the reliability of service. So the overall service levels will be down about 3%, which basically reflects operator shortages that we continue to see. Although we do have most of the staff have returned to work, there are still a number of people who are out due to restrictions from susceptibility to COVID. And so we're trying to, if we're putting something in our schedule, we want to make sure we can operate that trip. So that's the focus on the reliability of service. Let's go to the next slide. So it's kind of a tricky message. We're of course would love to have people riding our buses, but at the same time, people don't necessarily feel safe to be on transit, and they certainly don't want to be getting on a bus where everyone is standing and breathing on each other. And so it's a little bit of a tricky dance, and we still do have capacity limits on the buses, but we are trying to reiterate some of the safety practices that we are doing, and we are disinfecting every vehicle every day. So I guess in dark humor, one of the side benefits of COVID is our fleet has never been cleaner. And I know from some of our branding work that we had done about a year ago, prior to COVID, probably the number one complaint was about buses that didn't seem clean or smelled bad or what have you. And certainly from the limited amount of ridership that I've done, I've noticed that the vehicles are all much cleaner than they used to be. We're emphasizing the masks on before boarding, and the operators will pull to the side if a person on the bus is refusing to put a mask on, and we will either wait for that person to put a mask on or get off the bus, or if need be, then we bring a supervisor in to help facilitate the issue. You can go to the next slide. And so just here's more of the messaging around disinfection and keeping everything clean, and just trying to make sure that we are making customers feel safe and know that it is safe to get back on a bus. So we have a Safe to Go campaign. I guess I should also mention we have another one that a feature on our website called Room to Ride that allowed a person who was curious, wanted to know when they could get on their route, but didn't want to ride at the busy time of the day. They could look and see the average ride or average number of people on board a bus and on each trip at each location. And so it gave you an opportunity, if you did have some flexibility in planning, that you could change your normal routine and get on a bus a little bit either later in the day or earlier in the day. And actually somewhat related to that, we have seen nationally as well, a reduction in the peak nature of transit. Typically there's a large morning peak and a large afternoon peak when commuters come and go to the downtowns and other job centers. And definitely things have flattened out both for Port Authority and nationally. So next slide. So we're not standing still, and we are doing long-range planning. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Port Authority had just kicked off a long-range plan called Next Transit. Literally kicked off right in late February. So the timing was a challenge, but we have continued to meet. We're pivoting to more online meetings. We do have surveys that are online, nexttransit.net for anyone who's interested. And then we also did do, when conditions allowed during some of the late summer, we did actually have some kiosks, or like you can see in the picture here, there was a table with a sign that hopefully attracted people to come up. And frankly, even with all of the online meetings we did, all of the other online ability to communicate with people, we got at least half of the feedback came from these tables that we set out about the city. So we're working on identifying what some of the service gaps are. And I think particularly emphasized in our experience with COVID is that people want to go from neighborhood to neighborhood. They don't want to be forced to go downtown. Someone in Monroeville who works in McKeesport has to get on a bus in Monroeville, again, with very poor frequencies and long travel times, go all the way downtown, transfer to another bus, and go out to McKeesport. And that is prohibitive for most people. And so we're going to look at other ways to serve those neighborhoods and communities more directly. So looking at improving some of the infrastructure, shelters and sidewalks, and improving the pedestrian experience and the experience for people as they wait for the bus. Certainly a lot of work on fares. We actually also had a fare study underway and continue to advance some of the work on that as we look for opportunities for alternate fare products and ability to make transit affordable to all. And of course, looking for communities that are not served by transit, certainly out in the Allegheny area, Fox Chapel, Munhall, and better service out to the airport is something that people always ask for. And so that's kind of what we're working on with the long range plan. We'll be putting out a final report mid next year. But the pandemic has actually been a great case study for us to really kind of pivot our service more towards essential workers. Could go to the next slide. Now, aside from just the long range plan, we're also working on a strategic plan within the Port Authority. And so our senior team is redefining what are the core values for the Port Authority. I think we certainly, like most of the country, have been humbled by the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2020. And so that will certainly be a core feature for us. We're actually hiring a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. And that will be something front and center for us. We also do have a bus rapid transit project that will connect downtown, uptown Oakland, and some of the outlying neighborhoods, and will improve the frequency and reliability of the travel between those corridors. It's not very sexy, but transit asset management is important for us. We have an aging system, and most of you who have experienced the service will know that the bus stops and stations are in pretty poor shape. So we really want to focus on upgrading the stations and stops throughout the system. The state funding source for transit is primarily coming from Act 89, which sunsets at the end of fiscal year 22. And so time is running out for the state to kind of plan what the next funding source will be. So we're working on some contingency planning for various funding levels. And then I wanted to at least highlight for the GBA group that we do have battery electric buses. We have two 40-foot buses. You can see a picture of example running on Route 88 right now. We're actually excited about the experience we've had with those. We've got 6 more buses on order that will arrive and go into service late next year. And for the BRT project, we will have approximately 15 larger buses. They'll be the articulated buses. And so we're excited to start bringing some of the battery electric buses into the system as well. And so That's kind of, I covered a lot. I hope that I at least gave you a sense of where we're going and what our experience has been at Port Authority with COVID, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you so much, David. That was very informative, and especially based on, what Alice and I were talking about as we were planning out this series. We were really curious about how the pandemic has impacted essential workers and how they get around. And so I really appreciated hearing not only how the Port Authority is planning to respond to the needs of essential workers, but also how you've been dealing with your own essential workers. So that's
Yep.
incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. I think we have time for about probably one question right now, and then we'll save any more probably for the end, and then we'll transition to Kimberly's. But I wanted to let Allison, you had a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Well, I actually have two, but I'll take the first one. Do you anticipate rider changes associated with? Let me put my mic in front of my mouth.
Okay, thank you.
I have a habit of flipping it up to the top of my head. Do you anticipate rider changes associated with the changing weather, or associated with opening sports arenas, or even the people actually trying to actually have on-site school classes? I mean, do you think the ridership might start to creep up and increase with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And kind of a number of those things are certainly relevant right now. First, as you know, the Steelers did start to have, they've had 2 games with fans in the stands of about 5,500 people. In the past, typically about 10% of Steeler fans come to the games by transit. That was not the case for this group. Partly, with the smaller crowd, the parking was more available for those few that did come to the game. We did actually operate additional service. We still kept our capacity limits in place, and so it tended to slow down the people who were trying to get home after the game. After the game is the biggest challenge. But it was quite successful, and we did see some additional ridership from those games. University of Pittsburgh is going to start to have fans in the stands as well, so I think we'll see some fans there. With schools, in fact, just this week, my directors of service development will be meeting with some staff from Pittsburgh Public Schools as they begin to have more in-person activities. I know my daughter's school at Oakland Catholic is moving to fully in-person. So I do anticipate that we will see more people wanting to utilize transit, and particularly at the school-age kids. We do still have those capacity limits, and we are working. I'm very interested in getting to a point where we have some data to support adding more people to the buses. And so we're working on some plans for that. We're talking to the Allegheny County Health Department and working with our staff, unionized staff, to make sure that they feel comfortable as we add more customers as well. But the main driver, of course, is to make everyone feel safe, and so we're looking at how we can do that without driving other people away.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your presentation, and hopefully we'll have a little more time for discussion at the end too. But thank you so much, and thank you for that question, Allison.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll transition over to Kimberly, and I think Kimberly is going to have some interesting examples of problem solving through the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. As you heard, my name is Kim Lucas, and I am the Assistant Director for Planning, Policy, and Permitting with the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. Next slide. So today I'm going to go quickly through some of the things that we were able to do as a department and a city to support our businesses during COVID, something that we thought was going to only take a few months to clear up and has clearly lasted a lot longer. Next slide. So for those who are not familiar with the city's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, also known as DOMI, we are one of the newest city departments. We were founded nearly 4 years ago, and our mission is to provide the physical mobility necessary to support the social and economic mobility of the people of Pittsburgh. Next slide. We do this through 5 main goals. The first one is based around safety. Our goal is that no one dies or is seriously injured using our roadways. The second goal has to do with accessibility to fresh fruits and vegetables. We believe that every resident of Pittsburgh, we want them to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables within 20 minutes travel time of their home, even if that means they're taking public transportation. That includes their wait time. And we believe that that is a right that every resident should have and that they should be able to do that without having to own a car. Our third goal has to do with very short trips. Right now, I think something like 40% of trips that are shorter than 2 miles are driven in the city of Pittsburgh. And we want to help make those short trips more enjoyable and desirable in non-automobile modes. We know that when people choose their cars, they're contributing to congestion, they're contributing to air quality problems, and a number of other issues. And so we want to make sure by investing and improving the ability to bike, walk, and take transit, that super short trips are not always driven. Our fourth goal has to do with affordability. So we hope to maintain a situation where no household must spend more than 45% of their income, regardless of their income level, on the combined costs of transportation, housing, and energy. We recognize that we don't control the cost for housing or of energy, but we do think that by providing and prioritizing modes of transportation that are more affordable, like biking and walking and public transportation, that we can help maintain that affordability. And finally, our fifth goal is that our streets reflect the values and pride of our city. That means that they are attractive and welcoming places that are inclusive of everyone, regardless of accessible ability, needs, etc. Next slide. So the main problem, not the main problem, COVID, people getting sick is the main problem. But in terms of businesses being operate, a huge challenge that we were faced when the pandemic struck was how can we enable businesses through repurposing public space? How can we enable them to operate? Because we know that it's safer with better airflow and it's safer for operations, especially restaurants when people are outdoors. So how can we, in a constrained urban environment, make it so that businesses have opportunities to continue to stay open, which was critical not only for the businesses themselves, but also for the overall economy and for the city of Pittsburgh's budget. Next slide. We also wanted to make sure that we were doing everything we could to enable residents of the city of Pittsburgh safe spaces to bike and walk. We knew that when COVID shut down gyms and made it less safe to be within close proximity to other people, that we needed to do something to make our streets more useful and safer for people to be able to get out and recreate, especially within their neighborhoods. So our Slow Streets program, which you can see on the map here, and I realize I should have updated the map. This is a few months old. We have substantially more of them now. It's a community-led process where residents are able to go on our website and request that we look at turning their residential street into a slow street. What that means is that the city has provided signage and some cones, as you can see, that say street closed to through traffic, so that bikes and peds and people walking and recreating are able to have that space available to them so that they can not only use their space, but also be separate from other people. Next slide. Another program that we stood up had to do with how we used our curbside space. We knew that a lot of restaurants, for them to stay afloat, they were doing a lot more takeout activity. And when you have more people doing carry out for food, you need more places for those delivery drivers to park, pull over for short-term use, pick up their goods and leave. And so we stood up a new program for very short-term loading, essentially 15-minute time limit, design to sign, and we have been able to implement in some business districts in the city. Next slide. We heard from David, who was talking a lot about transit, and we knew that because of some of that general fear of riding public transportation, and because there was still a need for people to be able to get from point A to point B, we wanted to put out some guidance surrounding micromobility. What I mean by micromobility are those powered devices like electric scooters, electric skateboards that we know exist today and that many people are using in our city today, but aren't technically street legal. They're not allowed on our roadways per the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but they exist. And so we anticipated seeing more people using them because they can buy them and they're easy and people then can stay distance from others. And so we knew it was important for us to issue some guidance on where they should and should not use them. Even if they're not technically legal, we at least wanted to make some recommendations about not riding on sidewalks so that pedestrians could stay safe, while, letting folks know that there are better ways to operate. Next slide. So finally, our commercial districts. So as I started the presentation with, I was mentioning that for our economy to stay afloat, for us to, as a city, continue earning tax revenue, and for our residents to have a viable source of income, we needed to be creative about where and how we could enable those businesses to operate in the public space. Next slide. So sidewalk cafes are not new in the city of Pittsburgh. You've seen these before. It's where restaurants have been able to use the sidewalk outside their restaurants if there's a wide enough sidewalk and if they have the space to do it, to have table service or to have people take out food and sit and enjoy their meal. Um, Prior to COVID, this process to apply for a sidewalk cafe permit took months, required approval from 3 different city departments and signature by your respective council member. We knew that if we didn't modify that process, that businesses would not survive. And so we were able to get basically an emergency order from our council that said, we will waive the process requirements so that you can expedite these reviews. So we were able to shrink down of what had been a multi-month process to a very light touch, multi-day process. And we've been able to stand up a number of additional sidewalk cafes, which is our lightest touch approach because it's something that we already saw in the city and takes the least amount of space of the designs that I'm going to talk about. But it's something that a lot of people are really benefiting from. Next slide. So sidewalk extensions, these are the next most extensive options that we made available to people. As you can see here, this was our very first sidewalk extension that we approved outside the Apple Store. So a non-restaurant example, but an opportunity where the business came to us and said, we're taking appointments. We know we're going to have people waiting outside our store, and we would like a safe place for them to wait so that they're not blocking the sidewalk and so that they're able to maintain a social distance. So we've been able to approve these not only for businesses that are non-restaurant oriented, but also for restaurants where they're able to either move the sidewalk operations into that adjacent curb space so that they can use the sidewalk for their business, or the reverse where they're able to operate their business practices in the curb space in the roadway so the sidewalk is maintained open. Next slide. Here's another example of some sidewalk extensions that you may have seen downtown. The upper left picture is on Penn Ave. That was actually a protected cycle track. It was a 2-way protected bike lane. And because that was the space that was available for restaurants along Penn Ave, we shut down for a couple blocks the bike lane and moved it. So if you're going in the opposite direction of the automobile traffic, there's still a protected bike lane there. It's just shrunk down to 1 lane. If you're going in the same direction of travel as the Penn Ave one-way street, then as a cyclist, you are expected to ride with the cars, but we reduced the speed limit down to 15 miles per hour. The bottom example is from 6th Street, also downtown. So both of these were facilitated by the business improvement district for downtown Pittsburgh, who was able to invest in bringing in an artist, as you can see in the Penn Ave example, and to help implement some of the infrastructure that you see in both examples. And so it has been really great to work with organizations that have the resources to make this not only a functional space for their businesses to help them survive, but also into beautiful spaces to help them thrive. Next slide. And this is the most extensive option that we still have available, and that is a full street closure. This is an example in Oakland on Oakland Ave between Senate and Forbes, where we worked with, again, the Oakland Business Improvement District, where they were able to help finance the project. So the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure is responsible for managing public space and making sure that whatever modifications are made are accessible and safe from a transportation and mobility perspective. But there's ways to do it a little bit better. And so by working with OBID, you can see that there's actually some hardscape infrastructure that was implemented. The sidewalk was actually doubled, almost tripled in size by building up a wooden platform. And this was to enable the restaurants such as Stack to be able to have table service and also serve alcohol. So part of this process also had to do with the PLCB Liquor Control Board to make sure that whatever was implemented was something that would actually meet the needs of those businesses, especially those that are serving alcohol. This specific example combines not only space that is privatized, which is on the wooden walkway, but also shows and demonstrates in the middle of the roadway free space where anybody could get takeout and sit and enjoy. Next slide. So the future. So when we stood up this program, it was under duress. It was with the need to get something on the streets as soon as possible to keep businesses afloat. We were able to quickly stand up a task force that had representatives from the business associations, business owners, elected representatives, and city government staff that helped quickly define which direction we needed to go in. That was when we thought that this was going to be a 90-day long problem. It has become abundantly clear that COVID and our way of life is not going back to the way it was, not anytime soon, and maybe not completely ever. And so at this point, we are evaluating our 2020 program to figure out how to make it better because we know we're going to need something in 2021. So we have a fellow who's working with us, an honors fellow who is reaching out to businesses and also engaging the general public to find out what worked and what didn't work. He's also taking a look at what communities had successful applications for these street conversions and which ones did not. We know that in under-resourced communities that the ability to invest in the infrastructure to make these changes, to invest in the design, to request these changes is not something that everybody can do. And so while we've worked with some nonprofit partners this year to try to proactively engage neighborhoods that we thought might fall into that category of under-resourced, we know we need to do more. And so part of our evaluation is taking a look at where we had these implementations and where we did not, so that we have a better targeted approach next year. And even though it's 80 degrees today, winter is coming. And so we're trying to figure out, and about a week ago published a set of winter guidelines, how we can enable these public spaces to be used throughout the colder months. So that means considering heaters. That means considering tents. Of course, as soon as you talk about fire and cover, you talk about fire risk and you talk about spaces that lose some of those public health benefits of being open aired spaces. And so we're working with other communities to learn the best practices and to give that guidance to the community, and working with our other city departments to see what we think is safe, but also still a benefit and an improvement through the colder months. Next slide. So as I was mentioning, we just recently published our winter guidelines. These are going to be iterated upon as we learn from people implementing within our city, as we see great case best practices from other cities. These could evolve, but we knew we needed to get some guidance out there as soon as possible to help encourage businesses to be able to stay open as long as possible. Next slide. And again, evaluation. We want to find out not only from businesses who have the streets that they've been able to modify, but we want to also evaluate the program and talk to people who weren't successful in applying or chose not to apply to find out how we can make it better, because we truly think that this is not only a benefit in the short term, but we know, and as a sustainability oriented organization as Green Building Alliance knows, that when you reclaim public space and you make it a beautiful place for people to sit or to walk safely, you're improving the livability of that space. And so, to the extent that we can take lessons that we're learning through this emergency scenario and apply them and use them to catalyze longer term change to how some of our public space is sliced and diced, specifically maybe a little less to parking private automobiles and a little more to safe and accessible public shared infrastructure, the better. And so we're really taking a breath right now to try to figure out what those lessons are. Next slide. And on Engage PGH, this is our new website that was stood up during COVID by the Department of City Planning in an attempt. We knew that without being able to hold traditional public meetings, the city needed to find a virtual way to bring people together. So Engage PGH is essentially a one-stop information shop where residents and visitors can go online and see projects from a lot of different city departments. It's not just for city planning, it's not just for DOMI. And so we're using this platform to try to get feedback from the general public on, hey, you saw this roadway converted or shut down. How'd you feel about that? Did you like it? Did you not like it? What would you want to see different? Next slide. And again, evaluation. As I was mentioning, we know that not every community has the same access to resources. Many business districts do not have a business improvement district that's representing them and that can therefore invest in infrastructure for them. We've been able to support some of those locations by working with URA and Bike Pittsburgh. We've been able to procure certain infrastructure elements so that businesses can shut down the roadway without having to pay for it themselves. But we know that there are communities that still need more assistance. Next slide. And that is it. So I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kim. There were so many interesting things about your presentation, and then also just thinking about some of the things that David talked about. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is how you both, the Port Authority and DOMI had to make these really quick decisions in the moment, like you said, under duress to change something, while also having to decide how this is going to impact long-term changes. And then also keep, continuing to look at that over time, because it may not always lead in the same direction. So, but it is amazing how agile you can be and what you can accomplish. You have to, particularly, like you said, the process that it used to take to, get a sidewalk cafe now can be done in a matter of days. So I think that's wonderful. One question I have for you, I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but in terms of the Engage PGH feedback tool, have you seen anything, any feedback based on that trade-off of, opening up more space for dining, for example, but maybe having to lose some of the bikeways, even though I actually really appreciate the fact that then you augmented those changes with, changing the speed limit and things like that. So it sounds like you did your best to avoid a trade-off there, but have you heard any feedback on those types of changes yet?
A little bit. We just launched in fact, the Engage PGH page, I hope, is live, but that may have even just been a test because we've only been working on it for a few weeks. But we've heard some feedback. We know that going from a two-way protected cycle track down to one contraflow protected lane and a shared lane is not as good as what it could have been. But in a time of a crisis, we know, and as a cyclist myself and someone who used to drive buses, so I feel like very multimodal from a lot of different perspectives, we know that the trade-offs have to be made. We are in a very constrained urban environment. You go to some other cities and they have 50, 100-foot wide right-of-ways right in their downtown, but Pittsburgh is a historic city and doesn't have the physical space. So while we know that trade-offs have to be made, we're trying to make sure that we have the next best thing and that we're not, we didn't get rid of the Penn Ave cycle track and then just say, figure it out. We did make multiple accommodations.
Yeah.
So we are trying to balance all of those competing demands.
Great. That's great. And I know you and I talked about this, but I really appreciated the guidance on scooters and other types of micro mobility, because one of the things I was curious about is if someone is an essential worker and can't drive a car to work, but maybe either isn't comfortable getting on public transportation or isn't aware, of the things that the Port Authority is doing to make sure that it's a safe trip on public transit, what are their other options? And so I think that's really helpful too, to say, here are all of the options available if you need to get around because you have to go to work, and so it's good to know, like, okay, the Port Authority, is doing everything it can to make sure that not only is it a clean ride, but that you can also see how many people are going to be on the bus with you. And then, but also here's some advice if you can afford a scooter and want to take a scooter, and here's how we're making sure that you can still bike and walk. So I think that's incredibly useful. So thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. I will transition to Richard Price now, and I will spotlight your video, Rick. And so what Rick is going to share with us some information about how some other types of ridership are being impacted and informed by this particular situation, but also, I think it's important, we've talked about this, to ensure that we also keep an eye on some of those longer term plans that we all think are important, including things like clean vehicles. And so making sure that we have enough clean options available to us. And so I think I've got you spotlighted here, Rick, and I see you've unmuted yourself. So I think
Okay.
There you go.
Well, thank you. Well, again, I was asked to speak a little bit about how the Clean Cities organizations and transportation, all the different things that are going on. The Pittsburgh Region Clean Cities is one of almost 100 coalitions of the Department of Energy's Clean City Network, and we work across the state, but our area is basically the 33 counties in Western Pennsylvania, fuel neutral, technology neutral, anything to be able to reduce the use of petroleum-based fuels and help with emissions. Next slide. So again, we're going to just kind of
Rick, I think I lost you. I can't see you or hear you. Oh, there you are.
how.
I couldn't hear you for a second, but I've got you now.
Okay, next slide. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you see
Okay,
my?
next slide.
Okay, can you see the one?
Okay. Yes, I got it.
Okay.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the energy efficiency mobility system, EMS. Again, it talks about vehicle to vehicle, transit to vehicle, stoplight, everything that would reduce emissions, make things more safe across all mobility systems, and also accessible transportation. So this is something that DOE, it's a DOE program where we're working on. Next slide. So, how does it work? Again, it projects topics on connected automated vehicles, advanced fueling infrastructure, mobility decisions, urban science, and multimodal transportation. Next. So again, it's a supported research that we do. The Smart Mobility Consortium, as you can see, there's 5 national laboratories that are part of this R&D research. Again, it looks at vehicles, it looks at travels, it looks at systems, insight. There's a number of tools that are used to do that. It investigates how disruptive forces, such as automated and connected electric and shared vehicles, will impact energy consumption. It also helps communities plan, encourage energy efficiency in mobility. Looks at smart mobility projects and identifies system level opportunities to increase energy efficiency and the movement of people and goods. Next slide. So we'll look at transportation and choices. So according to a study done by Nature Research, 4,800 Pennsylvanians die prematurely every year from air pollution. outdoor air pollution, again, it affects humans, responsible for 5 to 10% of total annual premature mortalities in the US. Pennsylvania has the most premature per capita caused by air pollution of any state, and we're third largest amount in premature deaths caused by pollution. And we have the highest rates of premature deaths per resident. Next slide. So some of the things about rideshare, you heard some of the folks talk about with the ride sharing programs of Uber, Lyft, van pooling. I talked with a number of my stakeholders who have rideshare programs and rideshare in their entities, and they're telling me that their rideshare numbers are down almost 80% since the pandemic. It's affecting all different areas of rideshare programs, as you heard earlier from the folks from Port Authority. Next slide. So if you turn around and look at, we're going to talk a little bit about electric vehicle growth. You can see the electric and the plug-in hybrid battery electric vehicles, how it's jumped, and it's almost doubled annually to well over 6,000 vehicles in 2018. I don't have the 2019 numbers for you yet. We usually get those from Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. But as you can see, you had the Port Authority, the City of Pittsburgh, and other entities that are now looking at electric vehicles for either zero emissions or reducing emissions by using electric vehicles and electric transportation. Next slide. So, the benefits of electric is basically there's a big jump in the gross domestic product for the U.S. Again, the annual emissions that electric vehicles, you can see on the chart, you can get down to zero emissions depending on what your source is for drawing electric. But the annual emissions, if you just on an average vehicle that drives 12,000 miles, there's a great deal of reduction in across the greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we talked about public transportation. You can look at shuttle service. You can look at taxis. You can look at the buses, or we talked a little bit about bike and scooters. This is basically the main source, other than driving private vehicles, to getting to work. And talking with, like I said, one of the taxi people that their fleet is down almost 80%. They've had to lay a lot of people off because of COVID, because there's very few people that are riding these shared services. However, if you look at the one shuttle service, a lot of the workers, the hospital workers, especially at the UPMC hospitals, do have the ability to ride on the alternative fuel shuttles that UPMC has. And there's, again, the Port Authority with some of their electric buses and other transportations. And then many of them are using bicycles as transportation. Next slide. So we're going to look at the future transportation planning. So again, how can we help? Again, I've just showed you 4 pictures here of entities that are using alternative fuel vehicles. 3 of them are electric. Again, the Port Authority, the City of Pittsburgh, I believe it's their license and permits division, and then the University of Pittsburgh, who's using, I believe these are class 4 or 7 trucks that basically deliver their goods throughout the campus there. And then natural gas, again, is also reduces emissions on heavy duty vehicles. You can look at the City of Pittsburgh Climate Action Plan, has a lot of different actions, especially ones where they want to move their fleets over to 100% electric. The Southwest Pennsylvania Commission has a Smart Moves program. They have long range transportation development plan and multimodal transportation. And then the PADEP, environmental protection, the EV roadmap. And again, if you're looking for help in moving to these different technologies, there are a couple programs available right now from the PADEP, the Alternative Fuel Incentive Grant Program, which offsets the funding from a petroleum-based fuel to the alternative fuel, and then to drive PA forward deals mostly with removing for vehicles destroying diesel emissions vehicles, destroying engines, and also part of that, I guess some of the folks within the Green Building Alliance have used the EV charger program that they have under there for putting in both level 2 and DC fast charge program. And I just heard today where there were 4 more entities that are going to be installing chargers. I just saw on the DEP news this week that Western Pennsylvania got 4 more where we're going to see DC fast charge, which are also along the corridors for long range driving, as well as quick charge. And then you have over 240 level 2 chargers in southwestern Pennsylvania. Next one. So trends, how are people getting around? Again, we talked before about all the other different entities, and a lot of people talked about the bike and the scooter things. So there are a lot of that. I believe Bike Pittsburgh and a number of others have a number of places where you can get off of transits and use the bike sharing program. Port Authority also has the bike racks on their buses where you can put your bike on the rack, ride the transit and then finish going to the rest of the way to where your destination is using a bike. Next slide. So less people are traveling. They're doing doctor appointments virtually or missing appointments altogether. You heard me talk about reduced thing, or some of them are just driving more with private vehicles. And like most of us, or a lot of us, we're working from home now. Next slide. So let me go over the current challenges again. As communities move towards reopening their work sites, employees will again need to address challenges to continue to and from work. So that's, again, just 7% of the U.S. employers offered a telecommuting prior to the pandemic. And it's anticipated many companies will continue to encourage, if not all or some from home. I know there's a number of my stakeholders that have told me they won't be going back until after the first year, and including my own son, who said they may never go back, and they will be working home as an everyday. And then many workers will need to return to their work site, and the possibility that health concerns could motivate along with cause crippling congestion. And that's where all of this is coming from, is we tried to find a better way to maneuver and use different transportations to have less congestion. But if we're going to do that, then we need to do it in a responsible way in using an alternative fuel vehicle or a zero emissions vehicles to be able to do that. Next slide. And again, some opportunities. Major trend will be move transit authorities and operators towards on-demand shuttles and buses. You heard that being said. I think that, those communities that don't have an opportunity to go get to the transit, so they either have to walk or try to drive those. There's maybe some opportunities to do that. High cost, low demand, the inability to develop technology quickly. So it's looking at seriously at these services now, which many had already started to considering, like maybe taking an Uber or a Lyft to the area where you can get to the transit. Plan to include cleaner and more economical choices in transportation. You already see the city of Pittsburgh doing that. The state has a plan to move, I believe it's 25% of their vehicle fleet by 2025 to electric vehicles. Companies can help with chargers in workplace. There's a number of national entities who have done this across the country, where they're providing chargers at workplace chargers for their employees, giving them incentives to buy electric vehicles and incentives to charge there at either for free and or at a very, very low cost. Plan to move more efficiently way to travel to destinations. And again, these are opportunities for us to do. And then there's the federal and state tax credits for alternative fuels and infrastructure that are there now. And hopefully we'll continue to work and get those in the future. I think that's it.
That's so great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to turn on my video and get us back to a grid view. That I think was such a great way to end this, to wrap this topic up, because I think between you and David and Kim, you wove together such an interesting perspective on all of these different elements. So if our speakers want to turn your videos back on, Kim and David, we can finish up with some final questions and conversation. And for any of our participants who want to turn on their videos, please feel welcome to do that. But I think, what is so interesting to me and why I wanted to end with your presentation, Rick, is that I think we are going to see some behavior changes. Sorry, I now have a second grader joining me.
That's all right.
This is the new reality, right? So I think that we are going to see behavior changes that are moving away from what we've been trying to encourage for so long, including the use of public transportation rather than single occupancy vehicles. And now, like you said, people are either staying at home or, hopefully maybe using a bike or something, but oftentimes just using a car. So when we think about the long-term impacts, I think it's interesting to hear what all three of you have been considering for long-term planning, and hopefully that may translate to more green vehicles, right? And other types of, other methods of transportation. So I think that's incredibly interesting. And I think that one of the opportunities you mentioned, Rick, was the possibility of on-demand transit, which I think is really interesting. And David, you had mentioned something in the chat. Do you want to share what you had said in the chat?
Well, as Rick was talking about bikes, we do have bike racks on the front of our buses, and the question would always arise: well, how many people are putting bikes on the buses, and where do people get on? Where do they get off with those bikes? And we really didn't know. So we've just started a technology project where we will be able to count the ons and offs of bikes, as well as the people who are getting on the bus. And I think that will help give us some data that we might be able to target some of our future bike facilities to those locations where people are using bikes more frequently.
That's great. Thank you. Kim,
Oliver
has
yes,
Oliver.
Yeah, so bikes, can't miss an opportunity to talk about what the city of Pittsburgh is doing with regards to bikes. So earlier this year in June, so right at the heartbeat of the pandemic, we actually released our first Bike Plus master plan in 20 years. So it was about 10 years overdue. And it is a plan that recommends 120 miles of improved or new bike facilities to have a connected network citywide. And in addition, another 20 something miles of trails and the policies that are required to support those trails, such as working closely with the Port Authority to make sure that the connection between bikes and public transit is strong. We are about to end our first year of our rapid implementation program. So we had made a commitment to build 60 of those 120 miles within 2 years, leveraging support that was received from nonprofit from some grant support that was received by our nonprofit partners in the city. So I dropped a link in the chat to Move Forward PGH. Hopefully, if you're a City of Pittsburgh resident, you've seen some of our billboards or our bus wraps or perhaps on social media, the branding for Move Forward PGH, which is exactly that. It is our rapid implementation of bike facilities. It is a hard time to plan projects because the traditional methods of outreach are not ones that we can do right now. And combining that with the fact that this is a rapid implementation program, taking half of a 10-year plan and trying to do it in 2 years' time, it's a tall order. But please check out Move Forward PGH. We're also using the Engage PGH platform, which I'll drop a link in the chat to that I referenced earlier to get feedback on specific projects as well.
Kim
And-
and David, I would also, hopefully when all of this comes down, we're able to do things again in person. Maybe we can do some events together where we tie all three of the entities together, like at City Parks, Transits, and where we can bring electric vehicles for people to drive. And do, I mean, I think that's something that we could do. It's very hard to do it now, but at least we could possibly start planning in the future to do that. And that gives us even more, and we can even tie that into an education workshop or something.
Sure.
Definitely. And we're also, we were talking a little bit before the call about the first last mile connection to transit. Another program of the city of Pittsburgh is what we're calling the Pittsburgh Mobility Collective, or Move 412. I'll also drop a link in the chat in a moment about that. But that is an attempt to build out what we're calling mobility hubs throughout the city. So a physical location where you can go from transit to perhaps a healthy ride bike share bike. If scooters become legalized in the near future, which we're hoping they will, get on an electric scooter. There would be electric charging stations, pop in a car share car. And so we're working now, we're performing community engagement to talk to communities to say, hey, we think your community is close to transit, but could use a little better connection to public transit or to other destinations. And these are a couple more mobility options that we want to put at your fingertips. So give us your feedback on this proposal.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thank you for putting those in the chat. And I will also send them out in the follow-up email so that everybody has them. Allison, you had a question for Rick, I think.
Rick, I have two questions in, but can answer either one. The first one was among the various types of alternative fuels indicated at the very beginning, which do you see as having the most growth, especially for fleet owners and the availability of a refueling infrastructure? And the second question is, in terms of consumers, are there any types of facilities that present a challenge for alternative fuel vehicles?
Leslie, could you maybe repeat that, because I couldn't hear it really well?
Sure. And Allison, let me know if I get it right. So the first question was, what are the types of alternative fuel vehicles that you think have the best chance of being adopted widely by fleets? Is that right, Allison? I think I got that one right. And then the second one was, yeah, sorry, there you go, Allison. So which alternative fuel vehicles do you think will be most adopted by fleets? Is that the first one, Allison?
Yes. And then the second one was in terms of consumers, is there any particular type of facility that might present a challenge for alternative fuel vehicles?
Well, and again, I hate to use this word, but depends. There's no one size that fits all. So depending on what we're talking about, if a company has a fleet of cars, then I would probably venture to say it would probably be electric. If a company has a short, just a short delivery thing, such as the University of Pittsburgh, you can get electric trucks. You can use those in the natural gas. You can use those in propane. School districts, like I said, they're running. We're third in the nation in propane school buses. We have almost 1,000 in Pennsylvania. But so there's no one size fits all. Naturally, zero emission vehicles are the best for emissions there, but there's no one size that fits all on technologies. I think we're a ways off for electric and that in the heavy duty side. So natural gas ends up being a lot for natural gas, like your transit buses, your trash haulers, and your Class 8 tractors. They drive lots of miles and they get very low mileage. So again, there's a big benefit. It's not as good as if they were 100% electric, but because of the nature of their job. So it all depends. You can set that up, but that's what we do. I mean, we try to help folks. We give them the options, we tell them what's available, and we try to help them get funding. But that's what we do every day. We try to educate, and if we don't have the answer, we'll get it for you.
That's great. So if any businesses or building owners on the call here are curious, then they can reach out to you, Rick, to
Yes.
get some advice. Okay, that's great.
And with respect to transit vehicles, it'll be interesting to see the alternate fuel types and how that evolves. I think the nation will look towards California to see what happens there. California has a mandate that all of their transit vehicles be zero emission vehicles. Not sure what the date is, but it's a date in the not too distant future. And so while there already were a lot of agencies that operated compressed natural gas vehicles, certainly battery electric buses are very popular, but there are also hydrogen fuel cell buses. And, I think kind of like, I'll date myself a little bit, Betamax versus VHS, that you don't want to be caught on the wrong technology. So it's a little tricky to go all in on a particular technology. And, it sounds great that we're going to have maybe as many as 23 battery electric buses by 2023. That still is about 3% of our total fleet. So we've got a long ways to go. There's a lot of opportunities. I would love to increase that number faster and at a much higher rate. And so for us, probably the biggest stumbling block there, aside from just being a little nervous about the technology itself, is the funding. The upfront cost is a little bit higher for a battery electric bus, even though we're quite convinced that over the life cycle of the bus, it would be cheaper. But those upfront costs are the thing that is probably the initial stumbling block. And so that's a real challenge for us.
And we can't talk about fuels and talk to a group of real estate developers and things like that without talking about land use. If we have our cities planned well, where people can get around and get a lot of their basic needs met. One of our goals, as I mentioned, is getting within 20 minutes of your home without requiring a car, access to fresh fruits and vegetables, which is a fundamental need. That is something that if we have developers on the line thinking about mixed use, I know we are thinking and we're talking about it, and that's mostly what people want to do, but that's why it's so critical, because electricity is great for vehicles for localized emissions, and a lot of these options are great for localized emissions. But if your electricity is coming from coal or something else that has negative environmental impacts and you've just kicked it next door, then it's still not the net positive that we want to see. And so by hopefully getting folks on bikes or walking for those really short trips and really making it so that they can work and live and recreate near where they want to do all those things, have them be together, that's another goal of our city and many cities in planning.
I think that's
You brought up something really good there, was using renewables. The two hottest subjects again is renewable natural gas. I mean, we have so many landfills in this nation and in Pennsylvania where they're being able to capture that, or they're taking digesters and using, whether it's sanitary or agricultural, so it is. And I think one last other program, and I guess I didn't mention, was I think the city has a program for a park be within is it 10 minutes or 10 miles or something like that, where there's a park somewhere that everybody can get to within that neighborhood.
Most likely, green space is really important for people to get out and to be healthy. And so I'm sure our Parks Department is doing great work there.
Yeah, and I think you're all bringing up a great, reminder that our communities really operate as a system. And so, and that's partly why we really wanted to bring this topic into the sphere of those of us who are typically working in buildings, is that this is all a system, and every decision you make impacts some other part of the system. And so I think this has been a really intriguing conversation, both bringing up solutions that have been put into place, but also considerations for long-term planning that I think are really important. So we appreciate all of you, and I'm going to share all of these links and details in the follow-up email as well. But I just want to say thank you to all three of you, and we appreciate your time. And I can probably close it out there unless anybody else wants to stay around and chat, but we really appreciate it. If you don't want to get on